the heart of Yorubaland, a storm brewed. Not for days, not for months, but for 16 relentless years. A war of resistance, a clash of ideals, a struggle that shattered the spine of an empire. This was the Kiriji War, or as the warriors who lived through its fire called it, Ogun Ekiti Parapo. Long before cannons roared in Imesi Ile, before Ekiti's hills rang with battle cries, there was Ibadan, a city not born of peace, but forged in war. After the fall of the Oyo Empire in the early 1800s, warriors, refugees, and mercenaries gathered on a hilltop to build a new fortress, Ibadan. What began as a humble defense camp quickly rose into a city of conquerors. Built on blood, driven by ambition, Ibadan rose. They crushed Ijai, overpowered the Egbas, and one by one they brought the Ijesa, Ekiti, and Igbomina towns to their knees. Ibadan became the military titan of Yorubaland, commanding tens of thousands of battle-hardened warriors. With commanders like Oluyole, Ogunmola, and Are Latusa, they marched with one mission to rebuild the fallen Oyo Empire under Ibadan's rule. But power, left unchecked, soon turned to tyranny. Ibadan didn't just demand tribute, they dominated. They sent Ajele, armed agents, to enforce their rule. The Ajele were not mere messengers. They were enforcers agents of Ibadan's iron will. Sent into conquered towns, these men ruled like warlords, answering to no king but their own. They came with soldiers, with muskets and machetes, and with orders to break the spirit of any town that dared resist. The Ajele seized farmlands, demanded tribute, and claimed the best of every harvest as Ibadan's due. Those who objected were flogged publicly or disappeared entirely. They did not rule with diplomacy, but with dread. Women were not safe, neither were daughters. Kings were reduced to puppets, forced to bow before men they once outranked. In some towns, festivals were banned. Market days were taxed. Names were changed. Even prayers had to begin with Ibadan's praise. The Ajele weren't just rulers. They were a daily reminder of Ibadan's supremacy, an occupation masked as governance. Push a people long enough, steal their voice, bury their dreams, and what you get isn't silence, it's defiance. Because defiance runs in our blood. It's not taught, it's inherited. Even the meek will rise when cornered. And when fear turns to fury, resistance stops being a choice. It becomes survival. In Ekiti land, in Ijesha, in Akoko and Igbomina, fear gave way to fury. A storm was gathering, and in a quiet corner of Ekiti, Okemezi town, that storm finally broke. During a sacred festival, word reached a young warrior and prince, Fabunmi Abe Adesoye. The Ajele's men had desecrated a local shrine, stolen food meant for the gods, and brutalized the town's women. Blazing with fury, Fabunmi stormed the Ajele's quarters, cutting down everyone in his path. His blade showed no mercy. At the heart of the chaos, he killed an Ajele named Oyepetun. The spark had become a wildfire. Rebellion had begun. As word of the Ajele's execution swept through the land, it awakened a rage that had long been buried. In Ekiti and Ijesha, chiefs, kings, and warriors who had lived in fear now rose together against Ibadan's rule. At the palace of the Ure of Otun, the warlords of Ekiti gathered. There they declared one word that shook the land, Otoge. Enough was enough. And from that defiant cry, the Ekiti Parapo, the great Ekiti Confederacy, was born. Sworn by sacred oaths, bound by blood, they pledged to fight Ibadan's tyranny, no matter the cost, to the very end. Ekiti had no standing army, no cannons, no advanced weapons, but they had will. They had the hills for shelter, herbalists for protection, and an unbreakable love for freedom. New allies rose beside them, first Ijesha, then Igbomina, Akoko, and even the ancient kingdom of Ife. What began as a trickle soon became a flood. At Imesi Ile, sheltered by towering hills, the Confederate war camp was born. It grew into a town of over 40,000, warriors sharpening blades, blacksmiths forging iron in Ogun's name, women and children breathing life into a city built for war. Yet amid the rising tide, one thing remained absent: leadership. And then came Ogedengbe Agbogungboro, the legendary warlord of Ijeshaland. Reluctant at first, he finally rose and the tide of war shifted. The moment Ogedengbe rode into Imesi Ile, the spirit of the people soared. Out of respect for age and honor, young Fabunmi yielded command. Ogedengbe, the battle-scarred warlord, was crowned Seriki Meyaki, commander-in-chief of the Ekiti Parapo. And so began a war unlike any before, a collision not merely of armies but of fates. The war drums pounded, cannons shattered the hills, and from their deafening roar a name was born, Kiriji, a name that would thunder through history. Ogedengbe Agbogungboro, born Orisaraibi Ogunmodede, came from Atorin, a humble village on the edge of Ilesa, in what is today Osun State, Nigeria. Even as a boy, he was different, bigger, stronger, braver. With unmatched agility and mastery in traditional Yoruba wrestling, Ogedengbe became a living legend long before the drums of war ever called his name. His fearless spirit earned him the name Ogedengbe, the one who subdues the mighty, a title that would shape his life and seal his legacy. As he matured, Ogedengbe's skill in combat was matched by a sharp mind for strategy and leadership. He quickly rose through the ranks of the Ijesha warrior class, becoming a symbol of resistance in an era marked by political turbulence and inter-kingdom rivalry. By 1879, the hills of Imesi Ile and Igbajo echoed with the thunder of war cries. Across opposing hilltops, two great camps, Ibadan to the west, Ekiti Parapo to the east, locked eyes in a deadly standoff. Between them, the Fejeboyu stream ran red with blood, its waters darkened by the fallen. Trench by trench, cannon by cannon, the war dragged on. The soil itself became a witness, soaked with the blood of oppressors and the undying soul of the free. Ekiti Parapo warriors, equipped with imported rifles from Hamburg and cannons whose deep roar birthed the name Kiriji, began to overwhelm the Ibadan ranks. Though Ibadan bled, its front lines held firm, held together by the unyielding will of Are Onakakanfo Latusa. Are Onakakanfo Latusa, known simply as Are Latusa, was the military commander and de facto ruler of Ibadan in the late 19th century. One of the most powerful and most controversial figures in Yoruba history. Born in the small village of Ilora near present-day Oyo, Nigeria. On arrival in Ibadan, Latusa joined Ogunmola's private army and soon became the captain of his guards. Through sheer ambition, battlefield prowess, and political cunning, he rose through the ranks, eventually claiming the title of Are Ona Kakanfo, supreme military leader of Yorubaland and de facto ruler of Ibadan. Are Latusa's aggressive expansionist policies and the brutal rule of his appointed Ajelis in eastern Yorubaland became direct sparks for the Kiriji War. His relentless push to dominate Ekiti, Ijesha, and other towns fueled a wildfire of resentment across the land. For 16 relentless years, the Kiriji War scorched Yorubaland. Battle after battle, the powerful armies of Ibadan clashed with the Eastern Yoruba Confederacy, leaving hundreds of thousands dead in its wake. The Battle of Ikirun, 1878, a decisive Ibadan victory. They shattered the coalition's siege, breaking the enemy lines and leaving massive casualties in their wake. It was a bloody battle. Hundreds of coalition troops drowned in the Otin River trying to escape, giving the battle its name Jalumi, meaning drown in the river. By the late 1870s, Imesi Ile had become the stronghold of the Ekiti Parapo and the scene of repeated, brutal battles as the war dragged on. Each clash thundered through the hills, shaking the earth with the ferocity of desperate men fighting for survival. The battles at Igbajo and Iloro turned these border towns into fiery flashpoints between Ibadan and Ekiti forces. Gunfire and cannon blasts tore through the streets as each side fought with a fury that shook the very soil beneath them. Clashes here were frequent as both sides struggled for control of trade and movement corridors. The Battle of Otun Ekiti saw Ibadan forces launching relentless assaults against the town, a proud member of the Parapo alliance. The fighting was savage, wave after wave of bloodshed, destruction of properties, leaving heavy losses on both sides and the fields soaked in sorrow. The Battle of Okamesi saw the Parapo alliance fiercely defend the city, sacred as the birthplace of the Kiriji War. Every street, every hill became a battlefield as warriors fought with the fury of those defending the very soul of their cause. Skirmishes around Okamesi continued throughout the war, especially during the early phase of the resistance. Fierce battles erupted near Oke Emezi and Ipoti, critical lifelines for the Parapo alliance. Determined to strangle enemy supplies, Ibadan forces launched relentless assaults, turning roads and forests into killing fields. In war, cutting off an enemy's supplies is often deadlier than winning a battlefield. It starves resistance at its roots. Conflict raged at Ibere Ile and Ibode, smaller towns caught in the jaws of war, as both armies fought fiercely to secure territory and fortify their positions. Every captured foothold meant survival. Every loss pushed a side closer to collapse. These battles saw brutal trench warfare, guerrilla tactics, and the deadly roar of imported firearms and cannons, making the Kiriji War not just the longest, but also one of the most technologically advanced indigenous wars in Yoruba history. As the Kiriji War dragged on, Ibadan's once iron grip began to falter. Behind the walls of power, cracks were spreading, slow, silent, but unstoppable. At the heart of it all stood Are Ona Kakanfo Latusa, Ibadan's supreme commander, feared ruler, and a man slowly being devoured by the very power he wielded. Latusa had built his empire on discipline, conquest, and fear. But fear, once sown, grows wild. Suspicion crept into his ranks. His own lieutenants, once loyal, grew restless under his iron rule. The war still raged outside, but inside Ibadan, a new storm was gathering. According to legend, what happened next marked the beginning of the end for Ibadan's dominance. It all came to a head in 1885. The once unshakable Are Latusa stood on the edge of a storm he could no longer command. A fierce disagreement with his trusted commander, Balogun Osungbekun, sparked by a dispute over a single slave, trivial to some but deeply symbolic, was more than a mere quarrel. It was a crack in the foundation of his power. Whispers echoed through the palace halls. Loyalty wavered. The eyes of his warriors no longer held the same fire of obedience. The long, dragging war had drained them all. but it had emptied Letusa most of all. Faced with the unbearable weight of dwindling support and the possibility of being undone by betrayal or rebellion, he made a final, irreversible choice. In solitude, proud and unyielding even in despair, Are Letusa took his own life. The mighty warlord fell, not by the blade of an enemy, but by the silence of his own heart. Thus ended the reign of a man who once held Ibadan in the palm of his hand. His death marked more than the fall of a man. It signaled the beginning of the end for Ibadan's dominance. The warlord who had once boasted of crushing the Ekitis in 3 days was no more. In his absence, Ibadan's morale crumbled into dust. Still the war raged, but the cost was everywhere. Soldiers staggered with exhaustion, ammunition dwindled, and across Yorubaland, towns lay in ruins, families fled, and trade withered into dust. Over 200,000 men had marched to war. Thousands lay dead. Once thriving Yoruba towns became ghost villages. Ibadan stood weakened, Ekiti Parapo still defiant. The war, drained of blood and purpose, staggered toward an uneasy peace. In the end, the Yoruba civil war had no victor, only survivors. In distant Lagos, British merchants grew restless. The fires of Yorubaland's war threatened to scorch their dreams of trade and control. Commerce lay in ruins. The cocoa routes, once thriving, were broken. With profits bleeding away, diplomacy became a race against time. But by then, Ibadan and all of Yorubaland had fallen under a new shadow, the British Protectorate. Just like the African proverb goes, when brothers fight to the death, it is the stranger who inherits their father's estate. On September 23, 1886, at Imesi-Ile, a peace treaty was signed. The Ekitis were declared free, their long struggle finally honored in ink and history. Though the war officially ended in 1886, the last warriors didn't lay down their arms until 1893, when Governor G.T. Carter visited both camps and ordered final disarmament. In the end, it wasn't gunfire that ended the Kiriji War. It was fatigue and the fragile thread of diplomacy. The Ekiti spirit endured and triumphed. Ekiti Parapo was no longer just a name. It became a living memory, a symbol of unity, resilience, and the unbreakable will to resist. They were not the largest, they were not the strongest, but they were the most determined, and in the end, that made all the difference. The Ekiti spirit cherishes liberty above all, and when faced with chains, they chose death over a life without freedom. Fabunmi of Okemezi, Ogedengbe of Ilesa, the kings, the witch doctors, the Iyayus, they stood for liberty, for land, for dignity. The Kiriji War was more than a conflict. It was a declaration that no empire, no matter how mighty, can crush a people united by purpose.
Please subscribe to our channel.